The bloody handprint. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. It was a cold, moonless night when Emma arrived at the old farmhouse. She had heard rumors about this place, whispers that spoke of a curse, of vanished souls, and of a bloody handprint that would never fade. But Emma was no stranger to skepticism, and she had come to this dilapidated house in search of answers. She was a journalist, and this was going to be her story, the one that would break the silence and unveil the truth. The local townsfolk avoided the place, muttering superstitions that only made her more determined. The house loomed before her, an eerie silhouette against the darkened sky. Its windows were boarded up, but the door stood ajar, creaking in the breeze. Emma stepped inside, her flashlight beam slicing through the thick darkness. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay. She could hear the distant howl of the wind, and perhaps something else, a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. But when she turned her head, the house was silent again. The walls, once white, were now stained yellow and brown with age. Old family portraits lined the hallway, their eyes seemingly following her as she moved past. But it was the door at the end of the corridor that caught her attention. The door was different, newer than the others, yet worn in a way that didn't belong. It was ajar, just slightly, as if something or someone was waiting for her to approach. Her breath caught in her throat as she gently pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit by the weak light from her flashlight. The furniture was old, covered in dusty sheets. Yet there, on the far wall, was the thing that made her blood run cold. A bloody handprint, streaked across the wallpaper. It was large, smeared, and unmistakable. The red stain was fresh, as if someone had just left it there, and Emma could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She moved closer, her eyes fixed on the handprint. She reached out with trembling fingers, the air around her growing heavier, thicker. As she touched the stain, it was warm to the touch. Too warm. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand back, the stain of blood still visible against her fingertips, but as she did, the room seemed to shift. The walls began to groan, the floorboards creaked, and a voice, faint at first, started to whisper her name. Emma. Emma. The voice was like a soft breeze, but the words were clear. The air turned cold, and she instinctively backed away, but the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash. She spun around, her flashlight flickering, the darkness closing in around her. Her pulse raced as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Help me. The voice was desperate now, a mix of pain and pleading, and Emma felt something deep within her stir. She wasn't alone. Something was in the room with her. She wasn't sure if it was human, or if it ever had been. Shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, moving in ways that didn't make sense. A cold wind swept through the room, rattling the windows. The bloody handprint was no longer just on the wall, it was moving, creeping down, as if it had a life of its own. Emma stepped backward, panic setting in. She fumbled with her flashlight, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. The whisper turned to a scream. Leave. Emma spun around, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a figure tall, hunched, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to look right through her. Its hand, bloodied and stained, reached out, fingers curling as if to grab her. She stumbled backward, her body slamming into the old dresser. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing, the air growing suffocatingly thick. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she couldn't breathe. She knew she had to get out, but the door was locked. The shadows in the corners of the room were shifting now, moving with purpose, drawing closer. The figure in the doorway took a step forward, its mouth opening to let out a low, guttural growl. Emma's mind raced. She had to escape. But how? There was no way out. Her flashlight flickered one last time before going dark, plunging the room into complete blackness. In the distance, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching. But they were not her own. And then, just as quickly, the room was silent. She waited, holding her breath, not daring to move. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet. But then, she heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't just in her head. Emma. She turned, but saw no one. The house itself seemed to breathe, the walls groaning as if alive. The whispers continued, getting closer, circling her. She realized too late the bloody handprint had been a warning. Not a mark of what had happened, but of what was about to happen. A hand, cold and wet with blood, wrapped around her ankle from beneath the floorboards. She screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. It dragged her across the floor, toward the dark corner of the room, toward something she could not see but felt an overwhelming sense of malice. With every inch she was pulled toward the darkness, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She saw flashes of images, ghostly faces, the dark stains of blood, and then, a fleeting glimpse of the handprint on the wall, now covered in shadow. The thing that had once been human, now bound to this house, was coming for her. And just as her vision blurred and she was about to be swallowed by the dark, a flash of white light pierced the room, brief, like a fleeting memory. For a split second, the walls stopped moving. The shadows froze. The whispers ceased. But then they returned. "You're next." Emma's scream was the last thing that echoed through the house before the door slammed shut again, leaving only silence, and the bloodied handprint on the wall. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything around her. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to push herself up, but the bloodied hand still gripped her ankle, cold and firm, dragging her toward the darkness. Her body refused to obey her commands, her legs like dead weight. The very air felt like it was thickening, as if the house itself were closing in on her. With every inch that she was pulled, the suffocating pressure around her grew, a heaviness in the air that made her feel as if the room were pressing down on her chest. She could feel her own breath coming out in short, frantic bursts. Her mind raced. She had to escape, had to break free, but the more she struggled, the tighter the grip became. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the whispers, now a cacophony of voices, both male and female, young and old, reached a maddening crescendo. They were no longer just whispers, they were screams, anguished cries of souls lost in this house, their voices desperate, pleading, as if they could reach her, pull her into the same endless torment that bound them here. "Please," Emma gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she fought to free herself. "What do you want?" A voice, clear and cold, broke through the chaos, its tone like ice. "You." The hand that clutched her ankle tugged again, sending a sharp jolt of panic through her chest. The cold, clammy fingers were like iron chains, unyielding and relentless. She scrambled backward, trying to pull herself away from the grasp, but her body was too weak, too drained from the terror that surged through her. The room shifted. She blinked, disoriented, and suddenly the shadows seemed to take shape. The walls no longer looked like mere surfaces, they seemed to ripple, as if the house itself was alive, its bones shifting. A shadow moved from the corner of her eye, and when she turned her head, she saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, its skin pale as bone, its eyes hollow pits. It stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, each movement echoing with a chilling sound. Emma's heart slammed against her chest. Her body was frozen in place, her legs refusing to move. The figure was coming closer, its footsteps unnaturally slow, deliberate. The coldness in the air deepened, pressing against her skin, making it hard to breathe. "Help me!" The voice moaned, and for a brief moment, Emma thought it was her own. But then she realized the voice wasn't hers at all, it was the figure's. Or what was left of it. The thing reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and sharp, like claws. Emma could see the blood still clinging to its fingertips, dark and thick. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her body felt paralyzed, as if some unseen force had locked her in place. The figure leaned close, its breath cold and foul against her ear. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. "No one ever leaves?" The words reverberated through her skull, their meaning sinking in like poison. The realization hit her with the force of a truck. She wasn't just trapped in this house. She had been chosen. The bloody handprint, the whispers, the shadows, it had all been waiting for her. She had been drawn here, just like all the others before her. And now there would be no escape. The handprint on the wall flickered in her peripheral vision, and she turned toward it instinctively. It was no longer a simple mark. The blood was swirling, almost alive, forming new patterns, growing darker and deeper. As she stared, it began to pulse, as if it were a beating heart, and the room around her twisted and warped in time with the rhythm. A low, guttural growl filled the air. The creature moved closer. The air turned colder still, and Emma could feel the moisture in her breath freezing as she exhaled. The temperature in the room plummeted, and with it, her hope of escape. She could hear the thud of her own heartbeat in her chest, like a drum calling her toward her end. "Get away from me!" she screamed, her voice raw, but the words felt weak, pitiful against the rising tide of horror that surrounded her. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't move, except to raise its hand toward her, the blood staining the air like a dark fog. It was so close now that she could smell the rot on its breath, could feel its presence like a weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. She closed her eyes, but the sight of the figure was burned into her mind. The cold, dead eyes, the twisted mouth that didn't quite form a smile, and the blood a dark, sickening stain that marked its every movement. "You're one of us now," the creature whispered, its voice like a rasp, as it reached for her. Emma's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She fought back with every ounce of strength she had, kicking and thrashing, but the thing was too strong. It was too late. The room, the house, the very air seemed to bend around her, pulling her deeper into its grip. The handprint on the wall now seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. It stretched and twisted, as though the house itself was feeding off her fear. She could feel her own strength fading, her breath slowing. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of tortured souls, and in the distance, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow, like all the others, but this one was different. It wasn't he trying to drag her into the dark, it was watching. Waiting. She tried to call out, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Emma saw something else in them, something familiar. Her mind recoiled, and she realized with a jolt of horror that the shadow in the doorway wasn't he, some lost soul. It was her. The realization struck like lightning, but before she could comprehend it fully, the walls around her began to close in. The shadows, the whispers, the blood, they all surged together in a final, deafening roar. And then, there was nothing. In the morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale light on the old farmhouse. The door remained ajar, the air thick with dust, and the walls silent. But on the far wall of the room, there was a new mark, fresh, dark red, and unmistakable. A bloody handprint, large and vivid, where Emma's fingers had once touched. The end.